And the irony is, again, the whole culture, specifically the United States, is kind of predicated on it. That's why you have a lot of Asian sisters and brothers who will say, you know, we're almost invisible because the issue in America is largely black versus white. We're just kind of in the margins. I've heard folks say that. You know, we're here too. We have a history. We have a culture. But the irony is that relative invisibility, historically speaking, right? That's changing now with the rise of clearly of China, but was largely allowing folks in, say, the Chinese American community to continue to build, to network, and to strengthen their communities, and to do well under some very oppressive conditions at times, right? Because the Chinese also at one time were prevented from immigrating. Immigrating to the United States. The Chinese Exclusion Act, until it was repealed, I think after about 3 decades. But there was a long period of time when they couldn't become citizens because of a fear of China's presence. In fact, part of what people talk about, the yellow peril, that was a term from those days. The yellow peril was what they said. They were afraid the Chinese were too foreign to be absorbed into U.S. culture, Americana. But what it was straight up racism against this Asian community, the Chinese. But here's the key. Even though the mainstream media was often calling them the yellow peril, they didn't continue to call themselves yellows. So I'm trying to figure out why folks are still, trying to hold on to black. Here's my guess. The people very often who will tell you you're the one, because I've heard the same thing, and they come after me too at times saying based on my complexion too, because make an assumption. And I say, look, I just told you I've dedicated my entire professional life to uncovering and to teaching the legacy of African people, our contributions to the world, right? I was disciplined and dedicated enough to make that my mission. As the French might say, my raison d'être, my reason for being, or d'être, reason for being. But this idea of saying, you're doing that because you're self-hating, I turn it around and say, I think you don't want to call yourself African because you're not comfortable with being of African ancestry. You somehow think black gives you an out. Why? Because your image of Africa is still pejorative and you won't admit it because you still have contempt for many sisters and brothers who are from Africa. That's what I think. And when I've said that at times, I've heard people say, well, actually, yeah, I can't stand. And I'm like, I see it came out. And then I say, look, you can meet people from African countries who you don't like. You can meet people from European or Asian countries you don't like. You don't then deny your connection to your own roots by recognizing you're of African descent. You just say, I was talking to this Nigerian guy, a man, if you want to say brother, and the man, he tried to rip me off in the store or whatever, right? But that doesn't mean every Nigerian now that doesn't make any sense. Or people will sometimes say, well, but look at Africa today. Africa's in such turmoil, right? Well, yeah, Africa is in a lot of turmoil, there's no doubt. But the turmoil is the result largely of first the enslavement system, the asiento, followed by colonization or colonialism, followed by imperialism, which did everything it could coming out of the West primarily to prevent Africa from being able to ascend. That is not to excuse the fact that there are bad African leaders and have been. But we need to understand is many of those bad African leaders were sought out by outside powers that wanted to put them in power so they could continue to rape the resources of Africa. Africa's resource rich, but the people on the continent as a whole are resource poor, right? Something else that refers to what I said before, it's kind of like the Jedi mind trick, and that is one of my mentors, the late great C. Tessalone Keto, who was born in South Africa, trained as a historian, wrote a book called Vision, Identity, and Time. He basically was the first person to bring to my attention the history of South Africa and the process of telling the indigenous Africans they were not indigenous as part of the educational system. So they simply said, you all weren't here when we arrived. This is the formal education these people were getting. Also called them Kaffers, which is a derogatory term, as well as blacks. And what did the people who settled there, who were from the Netherlands and from the UK and other parts of Europe, but mostly from the Netherlands, meaning the Boers, and then like I said, many Brits. What did they call themselves? In particular, the Boers? Afrikaners. What do they call the language? Afrikaans. Think about what I'm saying. Psychologically, they got themselves and many of the Africans, thank goodness not all, but many of the Africans, to identify with being black more than they identify with being African. And then they formally, meaning the Boers, they formally called themselves Afrikaners, meaning Africans. So think about that. So now you're the newcomer. You arrived in the Cape area a few hundred years ago. Yes, your ancestors have been here for a long time, if long means a few hundred years. But you have now mentally, and you might even say psychically, conveyed to yourselves, you are more indigenous and have greater rights to the land than the people who you found when you got here. And you've convinced many of the people you found when you got here that they don't deserve to call themselves Africans, that they see themselves first as blacks.